All right. Well, greetings to everyone who is joining us and who are about to join us. You are tuned in to Against All Odds. Tonight's episode is being broadcast Thursday, March 24th, and the topic is propaganda. What is it? How is it affecting you? And what can you do about it? I'm your host, David Smithy.
And I'm your host, Eric Lukow.
And
And
this,
we're glad to be here tonight. Good to
yeah,
see you, Dave.
good to see you. It's Against All
Excellent.
Odds. Well, I think we're, on our fifth podcast, we've been really hitting the topic of the Ukrainian war, which seems like it's been going on for years now, and certainly for months.
Or
And
so it would feel if you listen to the news and the propaganda. Absolutely.
yeah, so I just thought that's a kind of a nice turning point for tonight's topic. Propaganda seemed to be on your mind. So, what are your thoughts, Eric?
Well, the way I started thinking about it was really I was sitting, so I may be driving somewhere, I can't remember, but I started thinking about how in the initial, time period of the war, you could look at some of our podcasts, I really felt like, Putin was certainly going to win. And, just the sheer size of his forces, his
Mhm.
economy, sort of the fact that we didn't provide weaponry very early
Right.
on or pre-war to Zelensky and his team.
Hmm.
The fact that he already had the Crimea, he's got the Navy down in the sea there. Really, there were so many things stacked in his favor. Obviously, ultimately backstopped by nuclear weapons. So we're just talking about a power, a great power, something, orders of magnitude more advanced in the military aspect than Ukraine, and as well as the economy. And then
Right.
there was so much in terms of having Russia, Russia sympathetic citizens in Ukraine as well. Just hordes of them, to the point where you've got these separatist regions up in the Donbass, and people in the Crimea. There's other places all over, frankly, Ukraine,
Right.
where you have a lot of sympathy for the idea that we're perhaps we should be part of Russia. And so I thought, with all of these advantages and the weak response from NATO, there's no doubt in my mind that the end result was Putin holding the territory of Ukraine. And then I realized that started changing, and there were points early on where started to think, wow, the Ukrainians might actually drive the Russians out, particularly when that convoy was stalled,
Yep.
and you started seeing, that maybe getting into Kiev, either wasn't possible for them, or you could argue. I think Putin started to say maybe that wasn't his objective. He had other objectives in mind. And even the advances down south with Mariupol and everything they were doing to secure their position in the Crimea, and moving north from there, the map got quite a bit of red going. And but still, you had this resistance from the Ukrainians that seemed to be extremely powerful, extremely dug in. You saw a lot of women leaving the country with children, and men, staying behind. Obviously, there was a law passed that fighting age men, I think between 16 and 40, had to stay.
Yes.
But you saw so many more staying regardless. You saw an influx of foreign fighters, volunteers coming in.
Right.
At one point, we thought they were going to be giving Polish MiGs over to the Ukrainians. And so we began to feel like, wow, with these, that convoy is going to be destroyed. Russia has not gained absolute control of the skies. I think the Stinger missile systems and then the SAM S-300 missile systems have really served to sort of at least, provide the Ukrainians an air defense. I believe they still have aircraft flying. So really, I began to think, wow, there is a large possibility that the Ukrainians will eventually make it so difficult for the Russians that the Russian economy also being attacked, by the West, and being destroyed. I thought, wow, there's a chance that Putin will just say, this is too expensive, this is costing
Right.
me too much,
Yeah.
and not just in terms of politically expensive for him as well, as
Mm.
well as economically and militarily. And you also saw the Russian soldiers sort of, there was a lot of early on Russian soldiers saying we didn't know why we were here, etc.
Yeah.
And then my thoughts started changing, and I started saying, but hang on a second here. Ultimately, how long can the Ukrainians hold out? There are large numbers of them moving west, moving into other countries. Business has got to be, shut down there. Their economy is getting equally destroyed, along with the Russian economy, as well as the infrastructure. And so I
Mhm.
began to think, at the end of the day, the original analysis is what is going to happen. And you started hearing a lot of news about China coming in and possibly, supporting Russia economically for certain, and maybe even militarily. and backfilling some of the things. And there was discussion about that. And you started to say, okay, well, with China's support, again, Russia can't, end up, we can't end up anywhere but with this whole map turning red.
Yeah.
And then, there were some discussions and talks opened up, and people began to say, well, maybe the, Western Ukraine stays under Zelensky and there's some freedom there with Lviv as the capital or something. And through all of this, I started saying, well, hang on a second here. Why am I going back and forth and back and forth? And, really, when I thought about it, I don't think the battlefield is going so much back and forth. If anything, the Russians have been from the start doing very well in the south and very poorly in the north. And it seems like that's still the case, 30 days later. And Android. And so if you get it, what have you gotten? One gentleman said, I ran a business in Mariupol. There's no building left. And so, are we going to build Mariupol right next to where it used to be? Or, the major cultural heritage sites, that opera house, the schoolhouse, the other things that were important to them were bombed. And so you get to a point where what are you fighting for and what are you protecting? Now, for the Ukrainians, it's Ukrainian soil, so that'll always be there, and I respect that. But you begin to get to a point where you start thinking, wow, I started thinking, what? Maybe Putin completely and entirely miscalculated here. And really what's going to end up happening is that he's going to drop off the stage as a world power. He might be a nuclear power, but really his economy is destroyed. Let's say he even wins Ukraine. Ukraine's been utterly destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
What did he gain from all this? He has a bunch of rubble, and then his own economy is gone. I also thought he may have overstepped his bound and miscalculated, because what if he does get pushed out or he does withdraw, and then, NATO and the Western nations come in and they do a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, which is really what I think they would do. And they'd come in with material and building contracts, and they would absolutely rebuild Ukraine to better than it was before. We saw that happen in World War II. We saw that happen in Japan. We've seen that happen in the Philippines. Other places where the U.S. has gone in and really rebuilt, countries and economies. It happened in Iraq.
Right.
And that's when I began to realize, to a degree, me and you are here as, average guys. We're certainly not experts. We're trying to parse the news. We're trying to parse the information. We're trying to get behind what's going on. And I really thought it bears to have a show on propaganda, because all the analysis I just went through has to be looked at from the lens of somebody wanted me to think those things, right? And there's reasons for it. And so really, I would argue that the real war is not what's going on the ground in Ukraine. That's the tragic war. That's the tragedy. That's where average Ukrainians are suffering horribly. And really, I'm not so sure either the leadership on either side actually really cares that much about that, except to use it as a propaganda tool. But the war for whatever is important here, something big is behind all of this. You can start to get a sense of that when you look at the propaganda. And what I noticed as I took a step back and I kind of redid that whole thing just to give you the background, I noticed that they kind of want us, every time somebody appears to be winning, they kind of jack up the other side. So you've got the ghost of Kiev, which turned out to be false, and then you've got, the missiles are working for the Ukrainians, and you got, but there's so many tanks from the Russians. They have the air superiority. They want to keep, it seems, the public on tenterhooks. They don't want us to allow us to come to a place where we just say, this thing is settled one way or the other. And I think this might be the real purpose of this war. And I began to recognize that me and you said several times on this broadcast, hey, we want to have broadcasts on the Supreme Court nominee. She seems like she's going to fly through, questions have been asked, but nothing's really going to stop her. We want to talk about Durham's investigation. We want to talk about the COVID-19 information coming out about the VAERS database. And I began to realize there's so many things me and you want to talk about, but we end up riveted on this war. I think that's happening to so many other people. And I can't help but believe that that's the purpose of the war.
And that is?
To distract us from what else is going on, right? I really feel like at the end of the day, they're gaining control in a number of ways.
Yeah.
And this war, it wasn't maybe she. I'm thinking it wasn't maybe she who said wait till after the Olympics. I think it's a number of people saying when's the right time to launch this thing.
Yeah, and I mean that's one of the goals of propaganda is to distract from the truth and distort the truth. So, we have talked about what really is going on in Ukraine and with Russia. We kind of have postulated that it does have to do with NATO advancing and encroaching on Russia's borders. You have Putin, who has repeatedly declared over the years, the concerns that he's had We talked about the water being dammed to Crimea. He's tried for years to bring that to the attention of the world stage. We talked about how NATO denied him access, to joining. And now Biden is on the way over to Europe to try to persuade the G20 not to include Putin in that conference. And, there are some lessons to be learned here from history. One is that, there's no such thing as a person who's just who starts out doing, quote, war crimes. There's a prelude to it. There's a ramping up to it. And, for as far as Putin's concerned, he is saying he's trying to protect his people. Now, he's an authoritarian. He's KGB. He also is a master at propaganda. But, it doesn't mean that that the media is also not a propaganda, mastering propaganda. We've seen that in the United States, and we've seen it in Britain. So I think the question has to become, and I'm glad to hear that the question is actually being asked in some cases, what is a war crime? Because if you define it too narrowly, you're going to find out that Russia is not the only one who's guilty, of these.
Oh, you mean if you define it too broadly?
Yeah. Well.
Yeah. Then you'll gather a whole bunch of nations.
Yeah. Well, that would a bunch of nations, but if you define it narrowly, it would really drill down on a couple of nations that are, I would just say, exporting war. And I'll leave it up to the viewer to determine who that is. But in terms of the propaganda that we're hearing, like you said, we're hearing something, and we're hearing it for a reason. Putin may have not been able to gain the ground that he wanted as fast as he wanted, but he sure has incurred the wrath of the nations in a very short time. We know that he's been financially sanctioned. He's been prevented from selling oil in the U.S. dollar. He had some issues coming up apparently with some debt, and there's further debt beyond that is coming due. So he's really being pushed against the wall, and that's causing him to look to China for support. So, what propaganda are we hearing from the media? Because the media is really banging the drums for war. If you watch any of these shows, MSNBC, Fox News, it doesn't matter, left or right, they are all banging on the drums to go to war and be involved with this conflict. And so there's no justification for it other than whoever's setting the agenda is using the media to try to ramp up, the sentiment of countries, primarily the U.S. And so here's something to consider. This was done in World War I. You'll recall, people will recall that there's a few things that actually led to the United States becoming involved with war against Germany. Not the least was the sinking of the USS Lusitania, which was a British ship, and because there were over 100 American passengers on that ship. And Woodrow Wilson had said, we will not act in thought. We will not take action or take thought against Germany. And when that happened, it started to change the American sentiment, but still we didn't enter. The Germans took Belgium, and then the propaganda, they actually had a name for it. It was called atrocity propaganda, where you heard about how the Germans treated the Belgians so poorly, and they were so brutal to them. This was not true at all. And but
I think they actually said the Huns are eating your children. There was claims of cannibalism.
Yeah,
as part of that atrocity. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Now, notwithstanding, another thing is worth noting here, is that American banks had lent money to the Allies, and if we didn't join the war, we couldn't ensure the victory, and they could have defaulted on that debt. So
paid us back in German marks.
yeah. So I mean, there's not always these pure motives for whenever we go to war, and usually it's over resources, natural resources.
Mm-hmm.
We saw that in Iraq. Mm-hmm. So where's this propaganda coming from, and what are they wanting us to think? And on one last note there, before I respond to that, there's a Russian, I can't call his position exactly. He's sort of like the a Secretary of State, but he's a media pundit for the Russian media. His name is Dmitry Peskov, and he said something to a CNN reporter about the nuclear option being on the table for Putin. So is this propaganda? What is this?
Well, you're sort of anticipating what I think, and it's exactly that. I two things jumped out at me in the news this week, and one of them was the comments that are coming out more and more frequently. One, we don't want to know. It started as we don't want a no-fly zone because that could create escalation, and we're talking about a nuclear power here. And I notice a pattern a lot in the U.S. news lately, and that is that things start out as absolutely that's ridiculous. You couldn't and wouldn't do that. Who's going to do that? And they kind of play that for a while, and then they start saying, well, unfortunately, we have to consider that. And then they start saying, really that's the only option. Then they start saying, actually, that's the wise option. That's what we should have done in the beginning. And it's like I watch this pattern of kind of almost desensitization. If we can repeat it over and over, so open borders. Nobody wants open borders. And then we're not saying open borders. We're saying dreamers. And then we're saying, well, only the people already here. And then we're saying, yeah, but what about there's caravans. And there's and then people are saying, well, you got to let the caravan in. Well, if we do that, and then all of a sudden it's saying, hey, but these people are actually coming across and good for our economy, which in many ways, by the way, they can be. There can be an argument made that for that. You could legalize that in a way that made sense to bring the honest workers in that do great work. But we all know that with open borders, you're not doing that. You're just letting anybody and their brother come through, which means a lot of drugs are coming through, a lot of very scary people are coming through, and potentially terrorists are coming through, and potentially diseased people are coming through. If you're seriously worried about coronavirus, and there's many other diseases. So open borders, that starts out as nobody can even think about it. It's unthinkable, and then suddenly it's very thinkable, and it's even a good idea. Well, I'm watching nuclear war start out the same way. Let's just I couldn't come out and say, you imagine if the first person who gets on CNN or MSNBC says, one thing we ought to think about is a nuclear strike against Putin. Everybody's the reaction would be so great. There'd be a tidal wave of absolute, you've crossed the line. That would be horrible. But if you start by saying, well, one thing is that, it could get to nuclear war, and we have to make sure that doesn't happen.
Right.
Well, now nuclear war is on the table, but as a, sort of, ugly stepchild, whatever, over in the corner or something. We're just, it's there, but we're not going to talk about it. We're going to do everything to prevent it. But, pretty soon it's okay. Maybe we should do a no-fly zone, even if it potentially risks a nuclear strike. And then we start saying, well, maybe he's going to strike us nuclear. Now we need to, be ready to respond. I mean, I find it fascinating that in the same week, nuclear war is being talked about. And here you're going to laugh when I say this. And the Hunter Biden laptop is finally verified by, not the source I was waiting for, but I guess the source, all liberals were waiting for, the New York Times. And so what's ironic to me is I'm thinking to myself, wow, these things are too coordinated. And again, it looks to me like the threat of nuclear war is at least being tested as another potential handle to control the American populace. Now we've got nuclear war on the horizon. I need emergency powers to respond. Everyone needs to stay home. Everyone should wear their masks in case of radiation. I want everyone to hop around on one foot just so save, the other foot for a potential soldier who's fallen. Whatever they're going to ask us to do, nuclear war is really, that's a scary thing. And they're running out of scary things. I saw briefly, I didn't read the article, but they said they're now tracking the Deltacron variant. So, the Omicron, as scary as that sounded, it's farther into the alphabet. We're at O now, we're getting closer to
Yeah,
Z. Something bad happens at Z,
that's like naming
the
hurricane.
Zydeco,
Yeah,
variant is clearly the one that kills everybody in a minute. But, Omicron sounded so scary. It came out of South Africa, and who know, and it turned out, no, it's this benign thing that actually somebody finally gets wise and says, this actually is kind of like a vaccination. It's better than the vaccination. So that didn't work. So we had to go, well, that scary Delta, and now Delta and Omicron. So it has the speed of Omicron
yeah,
and the power of death of
yeah.
Delta. It's the Deltacron, and it gets no traction. And I'm thinking, this is the problem for them. They have such a good playbook. Their playbook is think of something scary and then demand emergency powers. And in a sense, you look up at what happened in Canada and you say, wow, in a sense, the Freedom Truckers sort of played into that playbook because, you now do a protest, you shut down the Capitol. Yeah, you're barbecuing and whatever, but they can claim that citizens are afraid. And so that's where they went with it. They even were able to sort of blunt what I thought was an extremely peaceful, extremely well put together protest. And they blunted it by saying, well, hang on a second here. This could get violent. This is shutting down. This is dangerous. Emergency powers. And they got away with it. And so what I'm thinking is, that's all I can think of when I look at the propaganda. Somebody has decided to smash Russia. I mean, when I look at the be all and end all of this, if this goes on for another 3 months and he finally bombs the hell out of Kiev, and it looks like, or Kyiv, and it looks like Mariupol, what has he gotten? Yeah, he's got some sea access, but he's got a devastated country with, what's it going to end up being a populace that's, destroyed. And maybe he doesn't care about that, but there's no economic value there. This is not an operating country, and none of the Western countries are going to pile in and rebuild this economy.
Well,
So he's not getting much. But
talking about bombing, these countries, because let's just pause on that for a minute and drill down on it, because we've talked about it before, and I think we were one of the first podcasts that was mentioning it. Now it's become almost universal. Is the fact that these biochemical facilities, these labs were there. There was a number of them, over a dozen, and they were being funded with U.S. agency finances. And there's been no explanation for that, really. There's been real a lot of sort of dancing around the idea that yes, it's true, but what were we doing? You mentioned that maybe it was we were trying to fund the neutralization of those of cholera and those strains of diseases that had no business being tampered with. But I have to counter saying, how long does it take? 10 years, 20 years to?
Yeah, no, that's the stated was getting rid of Russia. But you're right. I mean, that doesn't take as many years as been.
And so that becomes an existential threat for Russia. It's airborne contaminant, that can easily cross borders. Who knows what method of injection that they could have used. Maybe birds could have carried it. Maybe they had some sort of, I don't know,
that's
function. Maybe something like that going on. And so those attacks on in those key areas included those labs. So there's a reason for that. But the propaganda is, the spin is away from that. So we get distracted from, what we know is a fact, that we were helping to finance that. Here's a fact. Hunter Biden's laptop was real. Here's a fact that if that had been pursued by the media, purposefully and truthfully, Biden would have for sure lost by at least another 30 million votes, as opposed to like the 60 million that he lost by, or, it could be calculated, but people don't maybe like to hear that. But hey, look, what other propaganda is there? If they keep covering up these stories, what was it that, the big guy was getting in terms of payments? Why was he in Ukraine? Why was he threatening the Attorney General of Ukraine's job? Why? There's all of these questions and there's no answers. And now, Biden is on a jet. He's going over to Europe to exclude Putin. Why is he?
I think he's arrived. I think he's had meetings already.
Yeah, and why is he trying to exclude Putin? What is it that he's trying to prevent Putin from saying in this meeting? We talked before about how if you censor thought, then you censor speech. It's very important that Putin not get an opportunity to say something at that G20 meeting. So, what is the spin on that? Why are we going to be told that he can't participate in it? Wouldn't it make sense for him to be able to be part of that global, economic community?
Yes.
Isn't that an opportunity just waiting to happen? Wouldn't Trump?
You have 19 other nations who could shake his hand and say, "Can you please stop?"
Yeah.
Well, why are you doing this? What do you need?
What is it? Yeah, and this reminds me of the whole issue with Japan. How we basically blockaded them, prevented Japan, an island, from being able to get food and supplies until they had to attack. That was a provoked attack. And
people don't see it that way. They look at Pearl Harbor, but they don't take a step farther back. I read a good book on that by, I think it's called The Hobo in Japan, but he was in Japan pre-World War II, and he was saying it was shocking at how they reacted to you abusing a scrap of tin. That they were, the metal was so precious to them in that country because of this blockade. This is sort of an anecdotal. He was walking around noticing that metal, a scrap soda can or just an old sign was just gathered up and used because metal was so scarce because of the blockade. So, he was seeing signs that, that this was going to lead to something. And what's ironic is the Japanese had made a gift of cherry trees. When you go to Washington, D.C., and you walk around the basin there, the tidal basin, it's all Japanese cherry trees and Japanese lanterns given it as a gift prior to World War II. Prior to World War II, we great friends, planted all these cherry trees. It was a gift. We were in good relations with them, and then we blockaded them. So, look, I want to let you finish if you want to add anything, but I actually had, I was asking sort of the same question as you.
No, I mean, I'm just kind of looking at some of these patterns, in history, because there's really nothing new under the sun and history repeats itself. And so these same mistakes or same, strategies are being implemented in order to make Russia the big bogeyman. And as you said, people get desensitized, rather quickly to COVID because we can't take one more variant. We can't put on one more mask. We're wearing 5 and, now we have to wear 7 masks. So at some point we're not going to wear any mask. And that's where we're at now. And so if they're not making you wear a mask in Maui, there's not
actually tomorrow. Tomorrow, the governor's emergency powers end. And I just got just on a side note, I just got a note from the boys' school saying, but the Department of Education of the state of Hawaii still recommends masks indoors. So we will continue to do masks indoors for children at our school. And I thought, wow, the emergency powers are gone, but now you have a recommendation, right, from the government entity. Yes. And everybody's been so well trained that the principal goes, okay, I guess we stay, until the recommendation is gone. Well, how long is that going to go on? Now, we're so far away from, the rule of law. We're so far away from any democratic input, through the legislature, and people are now responding to recommendations as if they're orders and regulations. It's ridiculous.
And you know what? That's why the jurisprudence system has to be involved. That's a lawsuit. I think a local citizen on Maui has to bring that as a suit and force a judge to make a determination. And on that note, Donald Trump today, I don't know if you caught the news,
brought out a couple of lawsuits.
Yep.
Hillary Clinton and Steele.
And James Comey and everyone that was involved, or many of the people that were involved in this RICO Act. And I'll tell you, if ever RICO was formed for a reason.
This seems like a pretty clear.
Yes.
And he's doing the right thing because we've been waiting for Durham, and he had to wait because Durham's going to be the one who ultimately is going to bring out all the facts. But he's doing it very slowly, and I have a feeling he's doing it because he's methodical and he's very thoughtful attorney. But I actually think he's very well aware of the backlash, and he's very very well aware that they're going to try and paste over it and paper over it. So he doesn't want to come out too early with something too little. He's building a brick house here, not a house of paper or even wood, because he does not want it blown down. So I think Durham's probably doing the right thing. It's too bad it's taking so long. And then Trump at this moment in time wants to bring more media to that and control it a little bit. So he brings his own lawsuit. Smart guy.
Yeah, good timing.
Here's what I kind of posited as the question. Once I started realizing propaganda is the real war here, I asked myself, what is nuclear war worth? If people are putting nuclear war on the table, and we've had like at least one congresswoman I've seen on TV say, we don't want nuclear war, but we should be willing to risk it. And I've seen other commentators say, of course we should give the MiGs. Yes, it risks escalation, but we cannot let Putin drive the ship by saying, hey, everything's going to risk escalation, and then we back down. That there is some logic to that. You can't let the schoolyard bully go on and set the rules, right? If you cross this line or that line, I'm going to punch you in the face. So that all of that's correct, but the fact that nuclear war is on the table as a discussion point, I asked myself, what could possibly, if I was a leader, make me think nuclear war was a viable option, a valuable option, something to think about? And the only thing I could think of was economic collapse. I thought, if I'm Joe Biden and I'm Xi and I'm Putin, or I'm the people above this, or the guy from Germany there, or the EU, and I'm looking at my debt structure and I'm saying this is beyond the pale. When these guys get in a room and everybody says, United States, we don't want to buy your debt anymore. Month by month, we don't want to float your treasuries. And the U.S. says, yeah, well, I don't really want to buy your stuff, Russia, and I don't want to buy yours, China. And Japan says, I can't buy everyone's debt. We're a big saving nation, but at some point, and people start going, hey, you don't want my debt, you don't want my debt, you don't want my, they're looking at, I thought to myself, it's interesting because I do think one of the biggest things propaganda has covered over is the incredibly, it's almost impossible to imagine, $30 trillion of U.S. debt.
Yes.
And then if you add the unfunded, liabilities, you get up to 130 or whatever. And then I have to imagine China has something similar. So there's another 30 trillion. And then, you add the smaller countries, and maybe with EU and everything else in the world, you get another 30 trillion, or $90 trillion in debt. And, everybody recognizes that inflation can trigger all of that. Inflation can flip the switch and drive back economic productivity so dramatically because people just start saving and they start hiding that really the governments aren't going to be able to tax their way out of that. And so I look back to Reagan, and he used to have this famous line, and it was something along the lines of, we're going to apply the common sense that you use at your kitchen table, that families use at their kitchen table, to the workings of government. And I don't think that's happened, despite Reagan's efforts, and he blew the deficit up as well, right?
Yeah.
So I think, it's gotten to a point where money doesn't mean anything at the government level. And when you get Biden going, and I think he passed, 2 or 3 trillion plus packages. That's the only thing I could think of. I would argue that, unleashing a biological weapon would be another reason to use nuclear weapons. If you really thought somebody was going to let out something, particularly if it was focused on your country, they were going to let it out in North America or something. I would argue, that might be a sufficient existential threat that you would see it as nuclear war. But I'm not talking about one party reacting to another. What I'm saying is, why is everybody in this? So we keep saying the Republicans and the Democrats are hawks. They're all pounding the war drums. But you have to add to that list, so is the EU. So are the Germans, right? So are the British are really aggressive when you look what their reports are about. And they're giving actually a lot of real intel on the ground when you read their reports. So is Putin, right? He's obviously the most aggressive of all because he's pulled the trigger and he's firing, right? it really is like, I think they called it the August Madness right before World War One, where people, they have these photos and people are just they're crowding city squares,
Yeah.
and their eyes are just glassed over, and they want war,
Yeah.
and that, of course, a couple of years later, all their boys are dying of trench foot, and they're they didn't want war anymore. But in August, that year, they were on hair trigger. And I look at this and I think, why are we talking about something as devastating and sort of ridiculous to even consider as mutual assured destruction, as nuclear war? Now, people are saying, well, he might use a nuclear weapon. I heard that theory come up in Ukraine to kind of just sort of settle the matter. And we did that in Japan. We dropped 2 nuclear weapons, but we were the only ones with the technology at the time. And it was the very end of the war. And we, dropped those bombs. A lot of debate about whether that was moral, immoral, the right thing to do, et cetera, et cetera. The idea at the time was that it would save Japanese and American casualties, as because trying to take Japan, would have been very difficult. Later on, it was found out that Japan was inherently almost unable to defend itself at that stage in the war, and so probably it wouldn't have been that hard to take Japan. But again, you can argue that throughout history it was done. I don't think there's a human being on the planet who takes even a small look at that.
The
who
thing
says,
is
let's do it again.
you can't, and again, it was this Dmitry that mentioned it. So, it doesn't come, and no one can say it came from Putin directly. So that's a ploy, that's a strategy, that's part of the propaganda.
And people are mentioning it on our side too.
Yeah, but that's sort of in response to a second or third tier, government official. So Putin can easily back away and say, hey, you know what? I didn't say that. I just said that all options were on the table.
But he did put his forces on higher alert.
But
nuclear forces.
Well, of course, he's going to posture, right? I mean, this is part of the propaganda. You have to, you have to kind of go through with some, first stage level movements, troop activity.
You have to rattle the sword.
Yeah, you have to rattle the saber. And so he's doing that, and but now the response, it's like, this is the proverbial bringing a gun to a knife fight. Russia's military is no match for the U.S. military or
the Ukrainian military, apparently.
NATO, even the Ukrainian. I mean, they can't even get through a good winter. So.
Oh my gosh! I mean,
and there's rumors of the Russian troops that are just basically stripping off their uniforms, getting into civilian attire, and making their way towards Poland. And I mean, they're advocating.
That's interesting. I wonder how many Russian troops would say, "I'm Ukrainian. Take me."
Over 100, like about 130, because I remember thinking to myself, that's maybe 3 platoons. It's not even a company, and so it's not even really newsworthy to mention that. But
although it does show kind of a morale, it's a signal of morale that maybe others haven't done that. But
but when you look at the combined forces, it's a small percentage, and you can just sort of factor that in.
Yeah, 200,000.
Especially if they're conscripts too. So I mean, it's propaganda, right? It's the propaganda spin that that Putin's troops are leaving him, and they show him in despair and isolated. They said that about Trump. They kept saying how Trump was in despair and he was always isolated, and nothing could have been further from the truth. So I think the idea is that we're being.
By the way, can I pause you there? That's super huge. Same story about Trump. Completely different. Completely different scenario, right? Domestic politics, and you're pointing out when they want to vilify a leader, they test out the despair and alone among his own people, paranoid. Thinking that he's going to be attacked at any moment. You're right. It's interesting. They did say that about Trump, and they're now saying it about Putin. It's kind of getting, wow. When it gets to the point where the average guys like me and you start recognizing propaganda sheets, they're like, let's try, bit 37.
Well, yeah.
Let's try Gambit 43. That didn't work.
The thing is that it's documented. So that's why they have to start, deplatforming people. That's why they have to start removing content. Because It's what
We
George
go
Orwell
back and say,
referred to as the memory hole. Is that people would that's why you burn books, because you want to get rid of the history, you want to get rid of the evidence and the proof. So anything that I was actually surprised to find that something that I was looking for on YouTube actually still survived there. And I was having this conversation with Julie about well, look, hey, who's worse? Where's the lesser of two evils here? I mean, if you want to go after Putin for a couple hundred people, who died, and a lot of those people were foreign, mercenaries for all practical, purposes, that got hit, and that because apparently some people on Reddit who were there were giving away their position. So who knows if that's true or not? But anyway, I'm the last person to want to see one human life, taken from the earth in a bad way. I'm certainly a man of peace, but I'm also a man who can recognize that, these things are going to happen. People are going to die, and how they die or how many of them die is.
Are you just saying in a war, or are you saying people are going to die in general? Like
I'm saying they're going to die through all these means. They're going to die from cancer. They're going to die from smoking cigarettes.
I understand your point.
They're going to die from drunk driving. They're going to die from war. And Madeleine Albright, who was the first female Secretary of State in the United States of America, you might recall her tenure, made the statement when she was being interviewed by Leslie Stahl of 60 Minutes that there was reports of 500,000 Iraqi children who were killed in these sorties that were being conducted over that country. And she asked Madeleine Albright point blank, was it worth it? To which she didn't hesitate and said, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I would certainly take a different view.
Now that's the children. That's not even counting, the adults and and the soldiers. And so, the thing is that, we have to wonder, like, what's the propaganda machine? How did we get into the war in Iraq? It was known. It's now a known fact that none of what was reported to us, by the CIA, by James Clapper and his ilk, that chemical warfare going on over there, chemicals that, Saddam had them and he was using them, and, everybody had to go to war because of that. And it was all bullshit, and the thing is that, Bush was there, Cheney was there, and Cheney, of course, Halliburton made a ton of money, and I'm about following the money trail. And we talked about it in one of our podcasts. Let's take a look and see what these defense sector stocks are doing and these industries are doing. They're doing really well. And so to me, the idea is that there's so much propaganda, and most of it has been against U.S. citizens on almost every issue that you can think of any import and significance, especially as it has to do with, war. Look at Vietnam, tell me that we won that. It wasn't even a properly, constitutionally declared war. And those men that went over there came back and they were,
they were damaged,
pretty much spit upon. They were never recognized for their valor, their honor. They went over there.
Psychologically, they were damaged.
Yeah.
And you can argue the entire U.S. society, I believe, I'm not an expert, but I believe that the drug culture stemmed directly from a lot of those returning soldiers who were addicted to hashish and pot, which they got into as a way to, deal with the absolute chaos and terror that they were required to be involved in Vietnamese jungles. And so I think the drug sort of culture kind of arose at that time, if I'm correct. No, I absolutely agree with you. I think
look at all the propaganda, right? It's just it's an onslaught, and we're, as you pointed out earlier, it's about, whatever the biggest fear, mongering tactic is. So they've had to escalate it all the way down to, Putin's got his finger on the nuclear weapons, and so.
Isn't that fascinating? And you look at it, and more people.
Sorry, I just want to finish your thread of thought, because, and I think you're onto something there, is because we have, multiple tens of trillions of dollars of debt that's circulating around all these countries, from Russia to China. The United States is the biggest debt holder of all foreign countries, and we're foreign to some country. We're foreign to China. They consider us foreign. So, and so the idea is that they're covering something up. What is it? Is it financial insolvency? Are we about to enter into some sort of, Great Depression?
Well, here's the fascinating thing. How is it possible that Ukraine, let's say me and you are onto something here, and Ukraine and the attack by Russia on Ukraine is something that people pushed him into? And there's a lot, as you started out the whole, our original podcast, pointing out he's been encircled, and he's been quite clear about how he feels about this, how he thinks about this. Historically, he has a strong argument. So a lot of people are saying, yeah, this was in a sense inevitable. Well, why, is it so it's so coincidental that the vice president made 23 trips or something over there? His son ends up working for a company. Now, you can argue that, I guess, wherever Biden was going to apply his political, talents or pressure or power that he had, that his son would follow along to sweep up the cash, because they certainly were in China and other places as well. But my point is, isn't it shocking that the Bidens are sort of at the center of this entire reality? Because if Putin attacking Ukraine is designed by the powers that be to be the trigger of the next world war, whether it stays conventional or gets nuclear, isn't it fascinating that they've been using the Biden family along the way? Because I think, what if we opened up that laptop and we started tracing, and we began to realize that the $1 billion that Biden was hanging over their head, somewhere in there was intended for these labs to do some kind of improper gain of function research. Perhaps that's one of the things they could be hiding. The $1 billion. Why do you give $1 billion to Ukraine? And then they've got a bunch of labs. So along with these grants, everybody knows, along with these investments, grants, debt forgiveness, whatever they're doing to these smaller countries, it always comes with strings.
Yeah.
So what were the strings for Ukraine? Because ironically, it wasn't to convince Ukraine to join NATO. Ukraine already wanted to join NATO. Right?
Yeah.
It was to convince Ukraine to, give us all of their gas, because they were giving it to Europe. What were they doing for us to be that interested? And so, well, they're on the border of Russia, so we want to keep them friendly. If we wanted to keep them friendly, we should have been loading missiles in there, not sending them MREs. So they were doing something for us to get that billion and all the other influence and whatever else we did. And then, of course, the Bidens are right there to pick up the scraps. But I think that it had something to do with these labs, and I think Putin would like to make that public. But that still is just a small side play in the larger picture, which is that it appears that if there is anybody or any group of people in the world who are pushing and influencing, I believe there has to be, right? Every homeowners association has the more active participants. They're gaggled over there, and they're forcing their will on the 80% who are too busy to participate. That has to be going on at the world level as well. So there's a small group of people who are forcing their will, whether they're the Illuminati and doing it through secret meetings in Venetian dungeons. I don't think so, but somehow, maybe they're doing it in broad daylight by just getting together and saying, what do we want to have happen at the G20?
That's it.
This group of people seems to want Putin to aggress to a point where NATO is going to respond. That's at least step one. I started out with that long soliloquy about what happened in the war and back and forth between Ukraine. And then I realized that's not the game here. All of the news is getting everyone to talk about the question of when NATO gets involved. When does NATO attack?
Yeah.
And so Biden came out from his first meetings. I don't know if you saw this. And I think he said, if Putin uses chemical or biological weapons, we will respond in kind. NATO will respond in kind. And I didn't have a lot of time to read before we got on here, but I saw one article where people said, well, obviously he can't mean that we will then attack with biological chemical weapons. I mean, that's really what in kind means, right? It means, identical physical reality.
Right.
He must mean that we will respond aggressively or something like that. But, I don't think, and I hope he's not saying, if they use chemical weapons in Ukraine, we're going to drop chemical weapons into Russia. That would be, that would be horrible in my mind. Another war crime. But he's coming out of these meetings saying, if they use this, we're going to respond in kind. And I'm fascinated because like you said, it looks like NATO wants to get into a war. They want to beat up Russia a little bit. And maybe they're thinking we need to show our military readiness to the Chinese. Maybe they're saying, why not remove this splinter in our side? He is right there. My argument in one of our podcasts was, why not invite him to join NATO to get rid of him and actually have him bolster? But for whatever reason, I don't see any rhetoric about how can we bring peace. Very few people are saying, okay, Zelensky has already agreed that he will not join NATO. So Putin's major demand has been met. Now you're talking about territory. I don't think he cares about the Donbass region. So you're really arguing about Crimea. And that's a real argument. So I'm not saying, that's easily, but you don't see Biden flying in there saying, I'm in support if we do this. Do you see any peace proposals being put out there or suggested by NATO or NATO nations?
Actually, as we talked about it, the media is really pushing for war. And and the media is the head of propaganda, and so again, this is the question: is what are we being sold? We know it's not the truth. We know what they're telling us is absolutely not the truth, and there's a number of things that we've found that we've talked about that are now a fact. Any reasonable person who is trying to protect their country would certainly bomb a dam that had been blocking the water since I think 2014, which by the way is when Zelensky came into power. And nobody's really talking about the idea that he was a comedian on a sitcom where he accidentally became the president of that country. And so what are you going to say? Oh, well, that's just art, life imitating art. Or are you going to say, like, I think there's the truth about Biden is that when this power, this cabal, this, G20, whoever, Davos group, whatever you want to call them, has decided that it's time to unmask themselves and deal in raw power. So they put the most feeble, almost, probably coming close to Parkinson's if he doesn't have it, old man in a parking lot where he couldn't even get 100 cars to show up. Everybody knows that Biden never had a group of people that was, that anywhere near the amount of people that attended the Trump rallies. He even said himself that he didn't need people to come and vote for him. He said that. I don't need you to vote for me. I just need you to show up after I win. I mean, these are the things that he says, and you think they're just the feeble-minded, forgetful, thoughtless sayings of an old man. But I think it was like he knew what the truth was, and he didn't have a filter for it because he's too old.
I think he was speaking out of school.
Raw power exposes itself and says, "See, we're going to put this guy up, and he's going to win, so that you're not in control, and we are." And we're going to dump those, however million votes, and we're going to do it in front of your eyes, and we're going to broadcast it on Fox News, who you thought was supporting you, and Fox News is going to betray you. And then we're going to set up the senators and the people, even the vice president that you thought was going to, back your man, and we're going to get to him too. We're going to show you what raw power looks like. And so now when they put Zelensky into a presidency, hey, that's what raw power does. This guy is beholden to the oligarchs. The main TV, the main media stations are all owned by these Russian oligarchs. So he's beholden to them because, he financed his election. And so, now, you have Trudeau. Trudeau is one of those that are of that ilk that are in that club. And, Trudeau has turned out to be and is now actually today, I heard two different people speaking, I think, at the United Nations and saying that he is a dictator and that he should be, ashamed of his, and that they called him disgusting. He's a disgusting person. To his face, they made these statements. They said, your presence is not required here. You should leave. So, these people know that, you can't go and blame Putin when you have a guy who in Canada is seizing bank accounts for people that are putting their money into something that they think that they should be able to support.
What he did with GoFundMe
Yeah, and then but the individuals, he would go freeze their bank accounts.
Mm-hmm.
Then they couldn't pay their electric bills. Then their
Mm-hmm.
kids couldn't go to school, couldn't get food, couldn't pay for heating, and literally, that's a technocratic, um,
Dictatorship.
dictatorship. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, how can you not say that that's an autocracy? He literally had his finance minister shut down those accounts, and people want to blame Putin. I mean, look,
Well,
you have
Zelensky, yeah, I agree. Zelensky also, I think, just collapsed all TV stations into one to avoid misinformation. So that's interesting. So let me ask you a question.
yeah,
You posit, you make a good point, right? They put Biden in, they put a comedian in, right? They've got Trudeau in, and you're right. There was some Paris group or whatever of young, future leaders or something
yeah,
that Trudeau's a part of, and so is all these other guys. What
Macron,
do they do with
Macron.
what? Yeah, Macron. What did they do? The best thing about the French is that absolutely beautiful way of speaking. So
Yes,
Macron,
right.
just sounds great. Their
Good.
food's delicious too. Everything else I can't really figure out. But
Yeah,
what I will tell you is this: although they eat frogs, which is strange, and snails, but what I would say is that my question to you is this: what happened with Kamala Harris? Because if you're right that they put Biden in, and that and I agree, sort of in your face. I remember when he was in his basement, for most of the campaign, right? That I remember thinking, gosh, that's a sure loser. And then, like you said, the comparison of the Trump rallies to his whatever parking lot meetings, and then you say they put in, the comedian, and then you say Trudeau is a product of this group. What was the thinking with Kamala Harris? Because I will note for you that propaganda, program number 47, which is that, she's desperate and alone and her staff is fleeing
yeah,
and she's a prima donna, we've heard that story before as well,
right.
is now being used on her. So, I mean, think about if Hunter Biden gets criminal charges, which have to involve Biden, it becomes if he really gets indicted in the next 6 months, it becomes very hard to imagine that Biden is going to live out his term. Why don't they have a better person for this? For example, the Supreme Court nominee, I can't pronounce her name, but
Mhm.
would seem to me a perfect person. She seems articulate and intelligent. She's completely left and way far away from anything that I agree is constitutional or real, but she is articulate. She can defend her position. I'm watching Kamala in some of these speeches repeat the same word over and over as if she's educating, elementary school children, and doesn't seem to be. I don't know. Does she review her own speeches? I mean, it's insane the way she talks. It has nothing. She doesn't look like a statesman at all. Stateswoman, whatever the proper word is.
Yeah.
So what happened with that? Why didn't they get a better pick there?
She was black, female, and those are probably two of the requirements. Honestly, Biden even said himself said that that's how he would choose his running mate based on their race and based on their gender.
And we did the same with the Supreme Court justice nomination as well.
And so
So you're just saying that even the controlling cabal, the levers of their control is identity politics. And so putting the white guy in the old white guy, I mean, Biden, if anything, stands for the establishment. He had real live contacts with Ku Klux Klan, grandmasters, and supported them politically and personally, I think. So, yeah, is that what you're saying? Even they have to kind of wrap the package, for sale.
yeah, I think that's part of it, and it was a way to possibly make sure that the first female president wasn't Hillary Clinton. That's
Something happened, right? Doesn't it seem like the powers that be
Yeah.
are not that supportive of Hillary?
Yeah,
Yeah.
something definitely happened, because I think at that level they have their own schisms, and so
So I heard a story that Jill Biden
yeah,
said some very negative things about Kamala Harris as picked as Joe's running mate. And and they laid them around, the excoriating racial attack that Kamala did, on stage against Joe Biden, right? Basically calling him a racist, and so very violently. Um, aggressively, I should say, not violently, and so this is coming out as well. So it seems to me like they're definitely, whoever is controlling the media has given the green light to attacking Kamala.
Well, that's another topic that we can pick up. We're at the top of the hour, and I think we probably need to wrap this one up. Any parting comments?
All I would say is this, is that, even in my own analysis, as we're doing what we promised the audience we would do, which is two average guys trying to suss our way through the news. And then at some point, hopefully we'll get to application here. You've heard a few of our points, being concerned about nuclear war, other things. But as we're doing that, everybody, and as we invite you to join us in doing that, let's keep our eye on the ball. If somebody's sending a strong message, they've thought about it. And that's propaganda by definition. And you have to kind of take a step back and ask, why do they want me to feel this way? Why do they want me to think this? Where does it lead me? What are my next actions? And, there's something about the economy here. Maybe they're trying to get us to start saving and take the economy. Who knows?
Mm-hmm.
But something's going on here, because it can't be just two nations fighting over what's very fast becoming a dirt patch. And something's going on here that's at a higher level. And somebody at a high level wants Russia and Ukraine both destroyed and taken out of contention. And they want us to do that through support for NATO and the U.S. to enter the war. That seems very clear to me.
Well, we'll know. We get more information every week. Things seem to be going at a very rapid pace. As we talked about at the top of the show, has it been, a month? Some news outlets are reporting that it's almost 2 months. And so they're really pushing with this propaganda. It's been really great to review that with you. And against all odds, Eric, we are going to find out just exactly what's happening. So for the viewers, stay tuned, and we'll bring the latest news to you as we see it. Just two guys who know enough to comment and perhaps even maybe prognosticate what this is all about. So stay tuned, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye, Dave. This has been fun.